The cellar door stood open before me, and the musty air carried secrets that had been buried for 18 years. In my trembling hands, I held the deed with my name on it, Evelyn Cruz, and below it, the signature of a grandfather I never knew existed. The wooden steps creaked under my feet as I descended into the darkness, my phone's flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed to whisper stories of the past. At the bottom, wooden crates lined the walls, and in the center sat an old desk with a single envelope marked with my name in faded ink. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I got here. How a girl who aged out of the foster system at 18 found herself inheriting a ranch she never knew existed, and how opening that cellar door would change everything I thought I knew about family, belonging, and home. 3 months earlier, I was sitting in the cramped office of Riverside Children's Home, staring at the stack of papers that would officially release me into the world. Nancy Gray, my caseworker, sat across from me with that mixture of hope and worry that I'd seen in the eyes of every adult who'd tried to help me over the years. She'd been the closest thing to family I'd had since I was 7 years old, when my mother disappeared and left me with nothing but a first name and a story that changed depending on who was telling it. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you were watching from and hype this video in the comments. I have a feeling you're going to want to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. The morning I turned 18, I walked out of Riverside with everything I owned in 2 garbage bags and a backpack. Nancy had helped me get a job at a diner downtown in a tiny studio apartment above a laundromat. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I had keys that belonged to me, a door that I could lock, and no one could tell me I had to leave. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. I'd been living on my own for exactly 2 weeks when the letter arrived. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was getting ready for my shift at the diner when I heard footsteps on the stairs outside my apartment. The mailman rarely came up here. Most of the mail went to the laundromat downstairs, so when he knocked on my door, I figured there'd been some mistake. The envelope was thick, official-looking, with the return address of a law firm I'd never heard of in a town called Cedar Falls, about 3 hours north of the city. Dennis Evans, attorney at law. The letter was addressed to Evelyn Marie Cruz, and seeing my middle name written out like that stopped me cold. I'd never told anyone my middle name. It wasn't on any of my official documents from the state. As far as I knew, only my mother had known it, and she'd been gone for 11 years. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. The letter was formal, full of legal language that I had to read 3 times before it started to make sense. But the basic message was clear. Samuel Flores, a man I'd never heard of, had died 6 months ago and left me his ranch. According to the letter, Samuel was my maternal grandfather, and he'd been looking for me for years. The ranch was mine, free and clear, along with all the property, livestock, and buildings on the land. I sat down hard on my second-hand couch, the letter fluttering to the floor. A grandfather. I had a grandfather, and he'd been looking for me. All those years in foster care, moving from home to home, wondering if anyone in the world was related to me, and somewhere in Cedar Falls, there was a man who shared my blood, who wanted to find me. The letter said I needed to come to Cedar Falls within 30 days to claim the inheritance and sign the necessary papers. There was a phone number for Dennis Evans, the attorney, and an address for the ranch. I stared at that address until the numbers blurred together. 1200 Oak Ridge Road. It sounded real, solid, like a place where someone could build a life. I called in sick to work and spent the rest of the day on the internet, trying to learn everything I could about Samuel Flores in Cedar Falls. The town was small, maybe 3,000 people, surrounded by farmland and forest. I found an old newspaper article about Samuel from 5 years ago. Something about him donating money to rebuild the local school playground. In the grainy photo, he looked like what I'd always imagined a grandfather should look like. Weathered hands and kind eyes, wearing a baseball cap and a flannel shirt. The article mentioned that he'd been a widower for 20 years and had no known family. No known family. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. He'd been alone too, just like me. While I was bouncing between foster homes wondering if anyone in the world cared whether I lived or died, he was 3 hours away, probably wondering the same thing. I called Dennis Evans the next morning. His voice was warm and patient as he explained the situation. Samuel had hired a private investigator years ago to find me, but the trail had gone cold when my mother changed our names and moved us to the city. It wasn't until after Samuel died that the investigator finally tracked me down through the foster care system. Samuel had left specific instructions in his will. If I was found, everything was to go to me, no questions asked. The ranch, the house, the 160 acres of land, even his truck and his dog. I had a dog now, apparently, a border collie named Wayne Ramirez, which made me laugh despite everything. Samuel had named his dog after some old friend from the army. Dennis offered to drive down to the city to meet me, but I told him I'd come to Cedar Falls. I needed to see this place for myself, needed to understand what Samuel had left me and why. I gave my notice at the diner, packed my 2 garbage bags and backpack into the beat-up Honda Civic I'd bought with my first paycheck, and drove north toward a future I couldn't have imagined. The drive to Cedar Falls took me through countryside I'd never seen before. Rolling hills covered with corn and soybeans, old farmhouses set back from the road with long gravel driveways, red barns that looked like they'd been standing for 100 years. The further I got from the city, the more the knot in my chest began to loosen. I'd always felt claustrophobic in foster homes, like the walls were closing in on me. But out here, the sky seemed to go on forever. Cedar Falls was exactly what I'd expected from the internet photos. Main Street was 6 blocks long, lined with brick buildings that probably hadn't changed much since the 1950s. There was a hardware store, a diner that looked like it had been there since the dawn of time, a feed store with pickup trucks parked out front, and the law office of Dennis Evans, attorney at law. Dennis was waiting for me when I walked in, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of firm handshake that said he meant what he told you. His office was lined with law books and family photos, and he had the same patient way of talking that Nancy Gray had, like he understood that sometimes people needed time to process big changes. He spread the papers out on his desk, the deed, the will, bank statements that showed Samuel had been more than comfortable financially. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, passed down from father to son, and now, finally, to me. Dennis explained that Samuel had been sick for the last 2 years, cancer, but he'd kept working the ranch right up until the end. The neighbors had been helping out, making sure the animals were fed and the property was maintained, but they'd been waiting for me. I signed the papers in a daze, my signature looking strange and official next to Samuel's flowing script. Dennis handed me a set of keys, 2 for the house, 1 for the barn, 1 for the old truck, and 1 that he said was for a cellar under the house that Samuel had always kept locked. He left specific instructions that I was to have that key, but no explanation of what was down there. The drive to the ranch took 15 minutes on winding country roads. I passed fields of corn that stood taller than my car, pastures with cattle grazing under oak trees that must have been there for decades, and finally a mailbox with the number 1200 and the name Flores painted in faded letters. The gravel driveway curved through a stand of trees and opened up to reveal my inheritance. The house was bigger than I'd expected, a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and windows that looked out over fields that stretched to the horizon. The paint was peeling in places, and the porch steps creaked under my feet. But it was solid, real, the kind of house where generations of families had lived and loved and built their lives. A border collie came running around the side of the house, barking and wagging his tail like he'd been waiting for me his whole life. Wayne Ramirez, I presumed. He was black and white with intelligent eyes and a way of looking at me that made me think he understood exactly who I was and why I was there. I knelt down and let him sniff my hand, and when he licked my fingers, I started crying for the first time since I'd gotten the letter. The front door opened easily, and I stepped into a house that felt like it had been frozen in time. The living room had a stone fireplace with family photos on the mantel, furniture that was worn but comfortable, and bookshelves lined with everything from farming manuals to classic novels. In the kitchen, there was a note propped against the coffee maker, written in the same handwriting I'd seen on my envelope. The note was from Gloria Sanchez, Samuel's neighbor, explaining that she'd been taking care of Wayne and keeping an eye on the house. She'd stocked the refrigerator with basics and left her phone number in case I needed anything. The kindness of strangers, or maybe not strangers anymore, maybe neighbors, hit me harder than I'd expected. I spent the rest of that first day exploring the house, trying to piece together the life of the grandfather I'd never known. His bedroom was simple, neat, with a photo of a woman I assume was my grandmother on the nightstand. In the closet, his clothes still hung in orderly rows, flannel shirts and work pants, boots lined up on the floor. It smelled like him, like soap and fresh air and something I couldn't identify, but that felt like safety. The second bedroom had been converted into an office, with a desk covered in farming records and correspondence. I found letters from the private investigator, reports on the search for me that dated back 10 years. Samuel had never given up looking, even when the trail went cold. Even when the investigator recommended calling off the search, Samuel had insisted on continuing. He'd paid for birthday cards to be sent to me every year, care packages that were returned because they couldn't find me, Christmas presents that sat in his closet, wrapped in waiting. In the bottom drawer of the desk, I found a photo album filled with pictures of my mother as a child. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 in most of them, a little girl with dark hair and serious eyes, standing in front of this same house, playing with a dog that might have been Wayne's predecessor, helping Samuel with farm chores. Seeing her young and happy before whatever happened that made her run away and change our names, before the drugs and the men and the chaos that defined my early childhood, broke something open in my chest. There was a letter in the album addressed to me in Samuel's handwriting. He'd written it a year before he died, when he was still hoping the investigator would find me in time for them to meet. In it, he explained about my mother, how she'd gotten mixed up with the wrong people when she was 17, how she'd run away in the middle of the night and taken me with her. He'd tried to find us, had hired investigators even then, but she'd been smart about covering her tracks. He wrote about how much he'd regretted the fight they'd had before she left, how he'd been too proud and stubborn to tell her he loved her no matter what mistakes she'd made. He'd spent 20 years hoping she'd come home, and when she never did, he'd focused all his energy on finding me. The ranch was mine, he wrote, because family land should stay in the family, and I was the only family he had left. That night, I sat on the porch with Wayne at my feet, looking out over land that was now mine, trying to wrap my head around the enormity of it all. 3 weeks ago, I'd been a foster kid with no past and an uncertain future. Now I owned 160 acres, a house, a dining, and a legacy I was only beginning to understand. The next morning, Gloria Sanchez came by to check on me. She was a woman in her 50s with calloused hands and a no-nonsense way of talking that reminded me of the best foster mothers I'd had. She brought fresh eggs from her chickens and homemade bread, and she sat at Samuel's kitchen table like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Gloria told me about Samuel, how he'd been a fixture in the community for 40 years, how he'd helped his neighbors through hard times and never asked for anything in return. She told me about the cattle I now own, 20 head of Angus that were currently grazing in the back pasture, and about the hay fields that would need to be cut in a few weeks. The responsibility of it all was overwhelming, but Gloria assured me that the community would help. Samuel had been family to all of them, and now, by extension, so was I. She also told me about the cellar. Samuel had always kept it locked, had never let anyone down there, not even her. Over the years, people had speculated about what he kept down there, but he'd always just smiled and changed the subject. The key Dennis had given me was apparently the only one, and whatever Samuel had hidden down there, he'd meant for me to find it. After Gloria left, I walked around the property with Wayne, trying to get a sense of what I'd inherited. The barn was huge, with stalls for horses I didn't have and equipment I didn't know how to use. The pastures were green and well-maintained, and the cattle looked healthy and content. There was a vegetable garden behind the house, overgrown now, but clearly once well-tended, and fruit trees that were heavy with apples and pears. It was beautiful, peaceful in a way I'd never experienced, but it was also intimidating. I'd never lived anywhere but apartments and group homes. I'd never been responsible for animals or land or anything more complicated than keeping my own small space clean. The learning curve was going to be steep, and I wasn't sure I was up to the challenge. That afternoon, I called Dennis Evans and asked him about help, about how I was supposed to manage a ranch when I didn't know the first thing about ranching. He gave me the number for Noah Hughes, a local farmer who'd been helping Samuel with the heavy work for the past few years. Noah, Dennis assured me, was honest and hardworking, and he'd be able to teach me what I needed to know. Noah came by that evening, a man about my age with sun-weathered skin and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're good at. He'd grown up on a farm, he told me, had been working the land since he was old enough to walk. He'd liked Samuel, respected him, and he was willing to help me learn the ropes if I was serious about making a go of the ranch. We walked the property together as the sun set, Wayne trotting along beside us like he was giving Noah his approval. Noah explained about the cattle, about when they'd need to be moved to different pastures, about the hay that would need to be cut and baled before the first frost. He talked about the equipment in the barn, what worked and what needed repair, about the seasonal rhythms of farm life that I'd need to learn. It was a lot to take in, but Noah was patient, answering my questions without making me feel stupid for asking them. When we got back to the house, he hesitated at his truck, looking like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to start. Finally, he told me about the cellar. Samuel had mentioned it to him once, had said that everything I needed to understand about our family was down there, but that it had to wait until I was ready. Noah didn't know what that meant, but he'd promised Samuel that he'd make sure I knew about it when the time came. That night, I stood in the kitchen with the cellar key in my hand, staring at the door I'd noticed but not really paid attention to. It was tucked into a corner near the back stairs, painted the same white as the walls, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. The key turned easily in the lock, and the door opened to reveal wooden steps leading down into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and started down the steps, Wayne whining softly at the top but not following. The cellar was larger than I'd expected, with stone walls and a dirt floor that had been packed hard by years of use. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with canning jars and old farming equipment, but in the center of the room sat an old wooden desk with a single chair pulled up to it. On the desk was a thick manila envelope with my name written across it in Samuel's familiar handwriting. Inside, I found letters, dozens of them, that my mother had written to Samuel over the years. Letters I'd never known she'd sent. Letters that told a story I'd never heard. The first letter was dated 18 years ago, just after I was born. In it, my mother wrote about how sorry she was for the things she'd said when she left, how she'd been scared and angry, and too proud to admit she'd made mistakes. She told Samuel about me, about how she'd named me Evelyn Marie after his mother, how she hoped someday I'd be able to meet him and know where I came from. The letters continued sporadically over the years, sometimes with gaps of months or even years between them. My mother wrote about our life, about the struggles with addiction, about the men who came and went, about how she was trying to get clean and build a stable life for me. She wrote about how much she missed home, missed Samuel, missed the safety and peace of the ranch. The last letter was dated 6 years ago, just before my mother disappeared. In it, she wrote about how sick she was, how the drugs had finally caught up with her, how she was afraid of what would happen to me if she died. She begged Samuel to find me if something happened to her, to give me the home and family she'd never been able to provide. At the bottom of the envelope were photos, pictures of me that my mother had sent over the years. School photos, pictures of me at foster homes, at birthday parties, at Christmas celebrations with families that weren't mine. Samuel had kept everyone, had watched me grow up through these glimpses my mother had sent him. There was one more thing in the envelope, a letter from Samuel to me, written just a month before he died. In it, he wrote about how proud he was of the young woman I'd become, how he could see my mother's strength in my face and his own stubbornness in my determination to survive. He wrote about the ranch, about how it had been in our family for generations, about how he'd always hoped I'd come home someday and take my place in that legacy. But most importantly, he wrote about forgiveness. He'd forgiven my mother for leaving, for staying away, for the choices she'd made that kept us apart. And he hoped that someday I'd be able to forgive her too. She'd been young and scared and struggling with demons he couldn't understand, but she'd loved me enough to keep Samuel informed about my life, to make sure he knew I existed even if we couldn't be together. I sat in that cellar for hours reading and rereading the letters, trying to reconcile the mother I remembered with the woman who'd written these words. The mother I remembered had been chaotic, unreliable, more focused on her next fix than on taking care of me. But the woman in these letters was someone else, someone who'd been fighting a battle I'd been too young to understand, someone who'd loved me enough to reach out to the family she'd left behind and make sure I wouldn't be completely alone in the world. When I finally climbed back up the cellar stairs, the sun was coming up, painting the kitchen in soft golden light. Wayne was waiting for me at the top of the stairs, and when I sat down on the floor next to him, he laid his head in my lap like he understood that I needed comfort. The next few weeks passed in a blur of learning and adjustment. Noah came by every day, teaching me about the cattle, showing me how to operate the equipment, explaining the rhythms of farm life that would soon become my own. Gloria brought meals and advice in equal measure, and other neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves and offer help. There was Christina Lee, who ran the feed store and promised to extend me the same credit she'd given Samuel. There was Gary Nelson, who owned the neighboring ranch and offered to help with the hay harvest. There was Wayne Ramirez, the man Samuel's dog was named after, who turned out to be a Vietnam veteran who'd served with Samuel and had been his closest friend for 40 years. Slowly, I began to understand that I wasn't just inheriting a ranch, I was inheriting a place in a community. These people had known Samuel, had loved him, and they were prepared to extend that same acceptance to me. It wasn't automatic. I had to prove myself, had to show that I was serious about staying and working the land, but the foundation was there. The first real test came when it was time to move the cattle to a different pasture. It sounds simple, but cattle have minds of their own, and moving 20 head of Angus from one field to another requires strategy, patience, and the kind of teamwork that only comes from experience. Noah was there to guide me, but he made it clear that this was my ranch now, my responsibility. We started early in the morning, before the heat of the day made the cattle sluggish and irritable. Wayne, it turned out, was a working dog, bred and trained to help with cattle, and he knew his job better than I knew mine. He circled the herd, nipping at heels and barking commands that the cattle seemed to understand, while Noah and I positioned ourselves at strategic points to guide them toward the gate. It should have been straightforward, but one of the young bulls decided he didn't want to cooperate. He broke away from the herd and headed for the fence line, and before I knew what was happening, I was running after him, shouting and waving my arms like I knew what I was doing. Wayne was right there with me, working to turn the bull back toward the group, and somehow, miraculously, it worked. When we finally got all 20 head through the gate and into the new pasture, I was exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, and prouder of myself than I'd ever been. Noah grinned at me and said I was starting to look like a rancher, and for the first time since I'd arrived in Cedar Falls, I believed it might be possible. That evening, I called Dennis Evans and asked him about Samuel's will, about whether there were any other family members who might have a claim to the ranch. I'd been worried about it since I'd arrived, the idea that someone might come forward and challenge my inheritance, that I might lose this new life before I'd really had a chance to live it. Dennis assured me that Samuel's will was ironclad, that he'd been very specific about wanting everything to go to me. But he also told me something else, something that Samuel had asked him to share when I was ready to hear it. There was money, more than I'd realized, enough to not just maintain the ranch, but to improve it, to expand it, to build the kind of operation that could support a family for generations. Samuel had been more than just a farmer. He'd invested wisely over the years, had saved and planned and built a financial foundation that would give me choices. I could hire help, could modernize the equipment, could take the time to learn without worrying about whether I'd be able to pay the bills. The knowledge was both liberating and overwhelming. I'd gone from having nothing to having more than I'd ever dreamed of, and the responsibility of it all was sometimes hard to bear. But as the weeks passed and I settled into the rhythms of ranch life, I began to understand what Samuel had seen in this place, why he'd wanted to pass it on to me. There was something about working the land that fed my soul in a way nothing else ever had. Getting up before dawn to check on the cattle, spending long days in the sun and wind, falling into bed exhausted but satisfied, it all felt right in a way that nothing in my life ever had before. I was building something, creating something, becoming part of something that was bigger than just me. The community continued to embrace me, slowly but surely. I started shopping at the local stores, eating at the diner, attending the monthly town meetings where neighbors gathered to discuss everything from road maintenance to the upcoming harvest festival. People began to know my name, to wave when they saw me on the road, to ask how the ranch was coming along. But it wasn't all easy. There were days when the isolation got to me, when I missed the constant noise and activity of city life. There were nights when I lay in Samuel's bed, in Samuel's house, surrounded by Samuel's things, and felt like an imposter. like I was playing at being someone I wasn't. The worst day came about 6 weeks after I'd arrived, when one of the cattle got sick and I didn't recognize the symptoms until it was almost too late. I found her in the morning lying on her side in the pasture, breathing hard and clearly in distress. I called Noah in a panic, and he came running, bringing the local veterinarian with him. Dr. Brenda Cruz, who turned out to be Gloria's sister, worked over the cow for what felt like hours, administering medicine and monitoring her condition. She explained that it was a fairly common problem, something that experienced ranchers learn to recognize and treat early, but that could be fatal if left untreated. The cow survived, but the experience shook me. I realized how much I still didn't know, how much I was depending on others to help me navigate challenges I should have been able to handle on my own. That night, I sat on the porch with Wayne and seriously considered whether I was cut out for this life, whether I should sell the ranch and go back to the city where I understood the rules. But in the morning, when I went out to check on the recovered cow and found her standing with the rest of the herd, looking healthy and strong, I knew I couldn't give up. This was my home now, my responsibility, my chance to build the kind of life I'd always dreamed of, but never thought was possible. I threw myself into learning with renewed determination. I read every farming and ranching book in Samuel's library, subscribed to agricultural magazines, watched online videos about cattle management and pasture rotation. I asked Noah 1,000 questions, shadowed Gloria as she tended her chickens and vegetable garden, and slowly began to feel like I knew what I was doing. The first harvest season was a revelation. The hayfields that had looked like just pretty grass to me turned out to be a valuable crop, and cutting and baling the hay was a community effort that brought neighbors together from all over the county. I worked alongside people who'd been farming their whole lives, learning not just the technical aspects of the work, but the social rhythms that made rural life work. There was something magical about those long days in the fields, the sun beating down as we raced to get the hay cut and baled before the weather turned. The work was hard, physical in a way that left me exhausted but satisfied. And at the end of each day, we'd gather at someone's house for dinner and cold beer and the kind of easy conversation that comes from shared labor. It was during harvest that I met Wayne Ramirez, the man Samuel's dog was named after. He was in his 70s, but still strong and vital, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He'd been Samuel's closest friend, he told me, and he'd been waiting to meet me since the day I arrived in Cedar Falls. Wayne told me stories about Samuel that filled in the gaps in my understanding of my grandfather. How Samuel had been a leader in the community, always the first to volunteer when someone needed help, always willing to lend money or equipment or just his time to neighbors in need. How he'd never gotten over losing my mother. How he'd talked about me constantly in the years after the private investigator found my trail. But Wayne also told me about Samuel's regrets, about how he'd been too proud and stubborn when my mother was young, how he'd driven her away with his expectations and his inability to accept that she might make different choices than the ones he would have made. It was a lesson Samuel had learned too late, Wayne said, but one he'd hoped I might learn from his mistakes. As fall turned to winter, I settled into a routine that felt more natural with each passing day. The cattle needed less attention in the colder months, but there was still plenty of work to be done. Fences to repair, equipment to maintain, plans to make for the following year. I spent long evenings in Samuel's office, going through his records, learning about the financial side of ranching, beginning to make the ranch truly mine. I also started making changes to the house, small ones at first. I moved some of Samuel's photos to make room for a few of my own, bought new curtains for the kitchen, planted bulbs in the garden that would bloom in the spring. It felt strange at first, like I was erasing Samuel's presence, but gradually I began to understand that he would have wanted me to make the place my own. The first Christmas I spent at the ranch was both lonely and magical. I'd never had a real family Christmas, had always spent the holiday in whatever foster home I was living in at the time, trying to be grateful for gifts from people who barely knew me. But this Christmas, I was in my own home, with my own dog, surrounded by the peace and beauty of land that belonged to me. Gloria invited me to spend Christmas dinner with her family, and I accepted gratefully. It was a revelation to sit around a table with 3 generations of the same family, to see how traditions were passed down, how love was expressed through food and stories and gentle teasing. For the first time, I began to understand what I'd missed growing up without a stable family. but also what I might be able to build for myself in the future. After dinner, Wayne Ramirez pulled me aside and handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a photo I'd never seen, of Samuel holding a baby who could only have been me. My mother must have sent it to him when I was very young, before everything fell apart, and he'd treasured it all these years. On the back, in Samuel's handwriting, were the words, "My granddaughter, Evelyn Marie, age 6 months, the most beautiful baby in the world." I cried then, standing in Gloria's living room surrounded by people who were becoming my family, holding proof that Samuel had loved me long before he ever met me, that I'd never been as alone in the world as I'd thought. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. The cattle were ready to be moved back to the pastures that had been resting all winter. And I managed the process with confidence this time. Wayne the dog and I working together like the team we'd become. The garden came alive with the bulbs I'd planted, and I added vegetables and herbs, dreaming of canning and preserving like Samuel had done. Noah and I had grown closer over the months, our working relationship evolving into something that felt like friendship, and maybe something more. He was patient with my questions, generous with his knowledge, and he had a way of making me feel capable even when I was struggling with something new. When he asked me to go to the spring dance at the community center, I said yes, without hesitation. The dance was like something out of a movie, held in a decorated gymnasium with a local band playing country music and couples of all ages spinning around the floor. Noah was a good dancer, and he taught me the steps with the same patience he'd shown me everything else about rural life. As we swayed to a slow song, I looked around at the faces of people who'd become my neighbors, my friends, my community, and felt a sense of belonging I'd never experienced before. But it was later that night, sitting on the porch with Noah and Wayne the dog, looking out over the land that was green and growing under the spring moon, that I truly understood what Samuel had given me. It wasn't just a ranch, wasn't just financial security or a place to live. It was roots, belonging, a place in the world where I mattered, where my choices had consequences, where I could build something lasting. Noah reached for my hand in the darkness, and when I didn't pull away, he squeezed it gently. We sat like that for a long time, not talking, just being present in the moment, in the place that had become home. When he finally spoke, it was to tell me that Samuel would have been proud of what I'd accomplished, proud of the woman I'd become. That summer, I made my first major decision as a rancher. The cattle herd was healthy and growing, and I had the financial resources to expand. With Noah's help and advice from other neighbors, I bought 10 more head of cattle and leased additional pasture land from Gary Nelson. It was a risk, a commitment to the future that said I wasn't just playing at being a rancher anymore, I was becoming one. The expansion meant more work, more responsibility, but also more satisfaction. I was building something, growing something, creating a legacy that could last for generations. When I signed in the papers for the additional cattle, my hand was steady, confident in a way it had never been when I was signing foster care documents or apartment leases. I also made changes to the house that summer, renovating the kitchen and adding a modern bathroom upstairs. It felt good to put my own stamp on the place, to blend Samuel's legacy with my own vision for the future. I kept his photos and his books, his furniture and his memories, but I added my own touches, made it a home that reflected both where I'd come from and where I was going. The community continued to embrace me, and I began to take on more responsibility in local organizations. I joined the County Cattlemen's Association, volunteered at the annual Harvest Festival, and even ran for a position on the school board. People listened when I spoke now, valued my opinion, saw me as someone with a stake in the community's future. But perhaps the most important change was in my relationship with Noah. What had started as friendship and mutual respect had grown into something deeper, something that felt like love. He was patient with my fears about commitment, understanding about my history of abandonment, and steady in his affection in a way that made me feel safe to open my heart. One evening in late summer, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Noah told me he loved me. The words should have scared me, should have triggered all my old fears about being left behind, but instead they felt like coming home. I told him I loved him too, and meant it with a certainty that surprised me. We talked about the future that night, about the possibility of marriage, of children, of building a life together on the ranch that Samuel had left me. It felt surreal to be making such plans, to be thinking about a future that included stability and love, and the kind of family I'd always dreamed of but never thought I'd have. As the first anniversary of my arrival in Cedar Falls approached, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. A year ago, I'd been a foster kid with no past and an uncertain future. Now I was a rancher, a member of a community, someone with roots and responsibilities and people who cared about me. I decided to mark the anniversary by having a party, inviting all the neighbors who'd helped me settle into my new life. Gloria helped me plan the menu, Noah strung lights on the porch, and Wayne Ramirez brought his guitar to provide music. It was a simple celebration, but it felt like the most important party I'd ever attended. As the evening wound down and the last guests were saying their goodbyes, I found myself standing in the kitchen where I'd first read Samuel's letter, looking out at the land that had become my home. Wayne the dog was at my feet, Noah was helping clean up dishes, and Gloria was wrapping leftovers for me to take to the elderly neighbors who hadn't been able to attend. It struck me then how different this scene was from anything I'd ever imagined for my life. I'd gone from being completely alone in the world to being surrounded by people who cared about me, from having no past to being the keeper of a family legacy, from having no future to having more possibilities than I could count. The second year brought new challenges and deeper satisfaction. I expanded the cattle operation again, this time adding breeding stock that would allow me to raise my own calves rather than buying them from other ranchers. It was a bigger investment, a longer-term commitment, but it felt right. I was thinking like a rancher now, planning not just for the next season, but for the next decade. Noah and I got engaged that spring on the anniversary of the first time he'd taught me to move cattle. He proposed in the pasture where I chased down that rebellious bull, and when I said yes, Wayne the dog barked his approval. We planned a simple wedding for the fall to be held right there on the ranch, with the whole community invited. The engagement brought its own challenges. I'd never planned a wedding before, had never even been to one that wasn't a quick ceremony in a courthouse or justice of the peace office. But Gloria and the other women in the community took me under their wing, teaching me about traditions and helping me plan a celebration that would honor both my new life and Samuel's memory. We decided to hold the ceremony in the pasture behind the house, under the oak trees where Samuel used to sit and watch the sunset. Dennis Evans would officiate, Wayne Ramirez would give me away, and the whole community would be there to witness the start of our life together. It felt perfect, exactly right for the life we were building. But as the wedding approached, I found myself thinking more and more about my mother, wishing she could be there to see what I'd built from the foundation she'd helped create by sending those letters to Samuel. I'd forgiven her, finally, understanding that she'd done the best she could with the tools she had, that she'd loved me enough to make sure I wouldn't be completely alone in the world. The night before the wedding, I went down to the cellar one more time, to the place where I'd first learned the truth about my family. I brought the photo of my mother as a child, the one where she looked happy and safe, standing in front of the house that was now mine. I propped it up on the desk where Samuel had left my letters, and I talked to her, told her about the life I'd built, about Noah, about the community that had become my family. I told her I understood now why she'd run away, why she'd been so afraid of coming home. Sometimes the weight of family expectations, of living up to a legacy, could feel overwhelming. But I also told her about the forgiveness I'd found in Samuel's letters, about how he'd regretted being too proud and stubborn to tell her he loved her no matter what. The wedding day was perfect, crisp and clear, with the kind of blue sky that seems to go on forever. I wore my grandmother's dress, altered to fit me by Christina Lee, who turned out to be an accomplished seamstress as well as a feed store owner. Noah wore his best suit and looked handsome enough to take my breath away. As I walked down the aisle between the folding chairs that had been set up under the oak trees, with Wayne Ramirez's steady arm to lean on, I looked out at the faces of people who'd become my family. Gloria was crying happy tears, Dennis Evans was beaming with pride, and Noah was looking at me like I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, full of promises about building a life together, about supporting each other through whatever challenges came our way, about creating a family that would honor the legacy Samuel had left us while building something entirely our own. When Dennis pronounced us husband and wife, and Noah kissed me under the oak trees where my grandfather used to sit, I felt a sense of completeness I'd never experienced before. I wasn't just Evelyn Cruz anymore, the foster kid with no past and an uncertain future. I was Evelyn Hughes, rancher, wife, member of a community, keeper of a family legacy. The reception was held in the barn, which had been decorated with flowers from Gloria's garden and lights that Noah had strung from the rafters. There was dancing and laughter, stories about Samuel and toast to our future, and the kind of celebration that comes from a community coming together to support two of their own. Late that night, after the last guests had gone home and we'd cleaned up the remnants of the party, Noah and I sat on the porch swing that had been Samuel's favorite spot. Wayne the dog was curled up at our feet, and the night was quiet except for the sound of cattle settling in the pasture and the whisper of wind through the oak trees. We talked about our plans, about the children we hoped to have, about the improvements we wanted to make to the ranch, about the life we were going to build together. It felt surreal to be making such plans, to have someone who wanted to build a future with me, but it also felt as natural as breathing. Over the next few years, those plans began to take shape. We expanded the cattle operation, added a few horses, and started growing hay on some of the fields that had been lying fallow. Noah moved into the farmhouse and we made it truly ours, blending his belongings with mine and Samuel's, creating a home that reflected all of our histories. The community continued to be our foundation. When we had our first child, a daughter we named Marie after Samuel's mother, the whole town seemed to celebrate with us. Gloria helped with the baby, Christina Lee organized meal trains, and Wayne Ramirez carved a cradle that had been in his own family for generations. As Marie grew, I began to understand what Samuel had tried to tell me in his letters about legacy and family. It wasn't just about passing down land or money or material things. It was about passing down values, stories, a sense of belonging and purpose that could sustain a person through whatever challenges life brought. I told Marie stories about her great-grandfather Samuel, about the grandmother she'd never meet but who had loved her before she was born, about the community that had embraced us and made us part of something bigger than ourselves. I showed her the letters in the cellar, the photos, the evidence of love that had survived separation and loss and time. But I also told her about the future, about the ranch that would someday be hers if she wanted it, about the community that would always be her home, about the choices she'd have because of the foundation we were building for her. 5 years after I'd first arrived in Cedar Falls, I stood in the same pasture where Noah had proposed, watching our daughter take her first steps while Wayne the dog, now old and gray but still devoted, kept careful watch over her. The cattle grazed peacefully in the background, the house sat solid and welcoming in the distance, and the oak trees rustled with the promise of another good harvest. I thought about the girl I'd been when I first got that letter from Dennis Evans, scared and alone, and convinced that I didn't deserve the good things that were happening to me. That girl couldn't have imagined this life, this sense of belonging, this deep satisfaction that came from building something lasting. But I also thought about Samuel, about how he'd never given up hope that someday his family would come home. He'd kept the ranch going, kept the community connection strong, kept the door open for a granddaughter he had never met but loved anyway. His faith had been rewarded, his legacy was secure, and his love had created the foundation for everything good in my life. Now, as I finish telling you this story, I'm sitting on that same porch where I spent so many evenings learning to be part of a family, part of a community, part of something bigger than myself. Maria is 8 years old now, and she has a little brother named Samuel, after his great-grandfather. They're inside doing homework while Noah fixes a fence that the cattle knocked down this morning, and Wayne the dog, now in his golden years, is napping in the sunshine. The ranch has grown and prospered under our care. We run 100 head of cattle now, grow hay and corn, and have started a small farmer's market business selling vegetables and preserves. But more than that, we become pillars of the community that embraced me when I was a scared 18-year-old with nothing but a deed and a dream. I serve on the school board and the county planning commission. Noah is a volunteer firefighter and coaches Little League. Our children are growing up with roots, with a sense of place and purpose, with the security of knowing exactly where they belong in the world. But perhaps most importantly, I've learned what Samuel tried to teach me through his letters and his legacy. Family isn't just about blood, it's about choice. It's about the people who show up for you, who help you build a life, who stick around when things get hard. The community that embraced me, the neighbors who became family, Noah who chose to build a life with me, they're all part of my family now. I've also learned about forgiveness, about how holding on to anger and resentment only hurts yourself. I forgave my mother for the chaos of my early childhood, understanding finally that she'd been fighting battles I couldn't comprehend. I forgave the system that had moved me from home to home, recognizing that the people in it had been doing their best with limited resources. Most importantly, I forgave myself for all the years I'd spent believing I wasn't worthy of love, of stability, of the good things that life had to offer. The cellar that had once held secrets now holds treasures. I've added my own letters to the collection, writing to my children about their family history, about the lessons I've learned, about the love that connects us across generations. Someday when they're old enough to understand, I'll take them down those wooden steps and show them where their story really began. If you're watching this and you feel lost, if you feel like you don't belong anywhere, if you feel like your past defines your future, I want you to know that it doesn't have to be that way. Sometimes the family we're born into isn't the family we end up with. Sometimes home isn't where we start, it's where we choose to build our lives. I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me about your own journey to finding home. Tell me about the unexpected gifts that changed your life. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, someone who might be struggling to find their place in the world. And if you're not already subscribed, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I share stories like this because I believe they matter, because I believe that everyone deserves to know they're not alone, that there's always hope for a better future. The ranch will continue long after Noah and I are gone, passed down to Marie and Samuel and their children after them. But more than land or buildings or cattle, what we're really passing down is the knowledge that love persists, that families can be built as well as born, that home is something you create with your choices, your work, and your heart. The deed may have had my name on it, but the real inheritance was the understanding that I was never really alone, that somewhere in the world, someone was always hoping I'd find my way home.